Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director of Semper Virens Fund. Thank you for joining us for another of our monthly series, Under the Redwoods, a webinar in which we explore the history, science, and art of coast redwoods. We like to begin these webinars and all of our events by acknowledging that the Santa Cruz Mountains and the redwood forests in which we work are the ancestral lands for many Indigenous people who stewarded those lands for millennia successfully until they were forcibly removed from those lands in the 1900s. We are grateful today to be able to work with some of their descendants, in particular the Ama Mutsun tribal band and the Mwekma Ohlone tribal band, in helping to restore cultural and traditional relationships to these forests. As any of you who have participated before know, we like to offer the audience a chance for question and answer. You can use the chat tool or the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to write questions to us. And at the end of our discussion, we will open the floor up to those questions. So please ask away, and those that we can't address in this hour together, we will try to follow up with separately. And also a reminder that this is being recorded and will be recast on our website should you miss it or want to share it with others. This has been a really momentous, and for our organization, a historic year for our conservation work in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This year marks the 10th anniversary of our purchase of the San Vicente Redwoods property, which is a large park-sized property that stretches from the ridge of the Santa Cruz Mountains nearly down to the ocean. It's contiguous with several other protected areas, which makes it part of a much larger and important conservation complex in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We co-own that property with our friends at Peninsula Open Space Trust, and together with them and Save the Redwoods League, we've been involved in all kinds of interesting and important stewardship and restoration activities there. And with our partners at the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County, we are readying the property to be open to the public for recreational access, probably next year. One of the projects that we've been significantly involved with, and it's been involvement that's lasted for probably a decade now, has been restoring Mill Creek and San Vicente Creek, two of the tributaries and streams on that property, for coho salmon and steelhead trout. These are both endangered anadromous fish. We've done a number of projects, but one of the most exciting culminated last week with the removal of the Mill Creek Dam, which is a centuries-old dam. And waiting at the base of that dam as if they were just ready for us to remove the obstruction were a number of endangered coho salmon. Our next webinar will highlight that. But it's just to say this kind of work takes a long time. And ironically, given our topic today, removal of that dam was hastened actually by last year's CZU complex wildfire. And that's because there were some water pipes going over that dam that had been a bit of a challenge for us in removing the dam, and the fire took away that challenge by melting those pipes. And as a result, hastened the speed with which we could remove that dam. So in an odd way, wildfire giveth and it taketh. And I'm sure we will hear a lot more about that today from our guest. We've spoken a lot in these webinars about wildfire already, but I am proud today to have join us Professor Scott Stevens. He is truly a national expert on this topic of fire ecology. If you see any coverage of this in the media, I'd say 90% of the time he's been interviewed and or quoted. He truly is an expert. We're lucky to have him locally, but his expertise really extends nationally. And he has also been, and for which I am grateful, a member of Semper Virens Science Advisory Panel, offering us advice and consultation on our work. So we are grateful for that. And in any case, with that, I'd like to welcome Professor Scott Stevens to talk to us about wildfire in our region, and importantly, not only what's happening with it, but really what we might want to do about it or what the future may hold. So welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you for the nice introduction. Very happy to be here today, everybody. talk about some fire issues. And certainly we've seen many of those happening in the state the last many years, and also intensified, I would argue, probably here in the last several years. And I hope that this might generate a little bit of discussion and some questions. As Sarah just mentioned, there'll be time for this. I will take maybe 25 minutes or so. I hope to maybe get through my little presentation, leaving, hopefully quite a bit of time for some questions and comments. So with that, I'll begin. So my first slide is something I think everybody might recognize. Of course, two of the most incredible tree species really in the world, and we're so blessed to have them here in California. Giant sequoia, of course, on the left, and a coast redwood on the right. So this idea of conserving California forests in a fire-prone and changing environment. So that's kind of the talk premise today. And I always just try to look certainly what's going on now, and certainly look to the past a little bit to help us understand, context. I think the past tells us a great deal, and then looking forward. And before I begin my talk, I actually, again, connecting to what Sarah says, many indigenous communities continue to be part of this land. And here is one of my colleagues and friends, Val Lopez. Val is the chairman of the Amamutsan tribal band, whose home range is quite extensive, from Santa Cruz down maybe halfway into Monterey Bay, and then all the way out to Highway 5, kind of a rough estimate of where it is. And one thing that I've always been intrigued by what Val will tell us is, look at that quote from him. This is what he tells us when we talk about fire. Fire is a gift from Creator for the stewardship of the land. The first time Val said that, I had to think about it for a while. I mean, that is an incredible way to look at fire and land. Fire is a gift from Creator for the stewardship of the land. We have Val come in, guest lecturer, class at Berkeley. I teach with Kent Lightfoot, and he talks about this kind of philosophy of fire and how it's so integral to the entire Amamutsan, and this idea that it's a gift and used for stewardship. I hate to say, but look at the way we think about fire and land. Mostly we think of fire as nothing but a devil, destructor. And this has been going down in our country's history. But the Amamutsan have a different view. And it's actually integral to their culture, and actually a gift from Creator for stewardship. We'll talk more about this in a moment. I just want to put this one slide up about redwood forest fire history. So this is when we use tree rings. So you can use tree rings to get a sense of what fire was doing in coast redwood forest. And what you see there are all these little arrows going to different parts of the coast redwood range. And these are where the studies of fire history have been done. And then the number close to the edge of the square on the left side has a composite C8, composite for number 2, 11 to 44. That's just telling you the fire return interval that have been found in these redwood forests, say back for the last 200 years or so, maybe 300 years. And I just want to show this to say that look how often fire was reported in redwood tree rings throughout its range. Down there in the very, very bottom, number 7 listed there is actually the northern Santa Cruz Mountains. It's a fire history study that I did with Danny Fry. And again, you find this amazing record of fire in these tree rings of coast redwood trees. Most of this record is in stumps, sometimes down logs, but this is indigenous burning. One thing about redwood is it's on the coast, of course, and it's generally kind of wet. We do get some lightning that start fires. I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more. But in general, we get very little lightning ignited fire in the coast redwood range. So when you actually get a fire history sample and you look at the fire scars in that wood in your hand, you're looking at really the kind of history of the Amamutsan and others. These are people that put fire on the land for management purpose. And there it is, right in your hand in a tree ring record. I find that to be really interesting. So what about redwood fire history? What can we do to summarize it? Fire was once very common in this forest type. Fire return interval maybe 8 to 20 years or so, depending on maybe the dryness or location of that redwood forest. Fire, at least in the last couple hundred years, has been largely eliminated from most redwood forests. There are exceptions. Of course, the CZU complex, as you heard about, and many of you know a great deal about. Ignitions were indigenous and continue to be human dominated. Still with the 2020, I have a little question mark there. 2020, of course, we had a lot of coastal fires ignited by that lightning storm that came through. And that really caught our attention, no doubt. So lightning fire is a part of this system, but I would still argue a relatively minor component, especially when you see the incidence of fire recorded in tree rings. It was indigenous tribes burning for a lot of reasons. I'd also argue that the fire history that we actually see in the coast redwood tree rings is a subset of the fires in the vicinity. And the reason is coast redwood has high canopy cover, relatively high relative humidity underneath of it. Compare that to things like coastal prairies, oak woodlands, other ecosystems in the vicinity. Many of these places are much drier. They're going to dry much more easily. Mark Finney did some work on coast redwood prescribed burning. He found out that when relative humidity got up about 40%, maybe 45%, that the ability to actually burn underneath a mature redwood forest was very limited because of just the humidity impacts to fine fuel moisture. So I think there's a lot more burning going on along the indigenous burning that once it gets into the redwood grove, many of those fires under some circumstances just went out because they couldn't penetrate into the grove versus burning in the more arid environment. So the redwood fire history is a subset of really the burning that occurred in this ecosystem. So when you think about that, you know, grasslands, mixed hardwood forest, redwood really have had a reduction in fire frequency over the last couple hundred years from reduction of indigenous burning. And I just put this next slide up. This is a mixed hardwood forest in the coastal California. And many of you have visited these places. They're everywhere, you know, Napa County, Sonoma County, Lake County, Marin County, Santa Cruz County. Pick your favorite county, and got a lot of mixed hardwood forests in the coast. I think in general, we've underestimated the change that have happened in these ecosystems in the last couple hundred years. Of course, people like myself have worked on conifer forest in Sierra Nevada, and we have records there that can really give us ideas of what the forest structure is, maybe 1910. So we can really measure and then compare from early measurements how things have changed. Unfortunately, we don't have a plot network like this in the mixed hardwood oak woodlands. But what we do have is this oral history of traditional fire use from indigenous communities, and then certainly the lack thereof in the last couple hundred years. I think we've had profound changes in these ecosystems, higher density of trees, more shrubs, I think also higher fuel loads. And I think it's an area that we need to do a little bit more work in because of just how much I think these things have changed. Here's the recent fire that was mentioned earlier. You know, of course, this was a very tragic fire in many ways. If you look at that fire, and I've been over in that country a little bit, you know, a lot of what this fire did was restorative. There was a lot of areas burned by the CZU complex. It underburned redwood forest, underburned oak woodlands, burned in some chaparral, created some gaps. So one thing I would say is this is really an unprecedented event in terms of fire impacting large scale area of Santa Cruz County. And I think we need to use this. We got to use this as a way to anchor prescribed burning, future burning, and also cultural burning. One of the most difficult things to do in any burning enterprise is if you go to a place that's almost had no burning and you start to begin a burning program, you've got so little to work with in terms of low fuel loads here, low fuel loads over there. You don't have that mosaic of really age and fuel to drop. And this is certainly the case in most of California, including Santa Cruz County. But the CZU complex changed that. Okay, it burned a lot of areas, some of it restorative, some of it actually higher intensity and burned more damaging fire. That certainly happened as well. And of course, life was lost on the CZU complex and hundreds of homes. And that is a tragedy. I know it is. I have had several of my friends have lost homes recently and family members in different fires in California. So that is a big issue, right? But still, I think state parks, NGOs, private land, tribes, and even communities in this region really need to use this event as a linchpin in a long-term program of prescribed burning, cultural burning. Because you've got an opportunity now that did not exist 10 years ago or just even a few years ago. You've got places you could burn against. You could underburn places that burned once in the CZU, do it again. There are so many opportunities to use that event to actually jumpstart a program for prescribed fire and cultural burning in this area. It's a high price to pay, though. The high price was all the homes lost, the life lost, the economics of the system, smoke impacts. All this is certainly a high price, but it does leave a legacy that you could use to actually try to go forward in a proactive sense, an opportunity that I don't think we should waste. So this is really, I guess, some ways a call to arms to bring fire back into these systems, get it back in there, and use the CZU complex as a place of opportunity, because it is. It absolutely is. You underburn a lot of these places that haven't burned in 100 years. You've taken out so much surface fuel, you reduce ladder fuel, and you really are in a place that in a few years, some of that stuff's going to come on the ground. You could reburn it maybe in 10 years. Then you can burn maybe adjacent to it and move a fire into the CZU complex that burned a few years ago. There are opportunities there in that landscape that never existed before. We got to use this opportunity. Well, let's hop a little bit to a different part of California. We're going to mixed conifer giant sequoia forest in the Sierra Nevada. Of course, we've had some extensive fires in this type recently as well. I'll show you some pictures of that in a moment, but I know this is another really iconic species in California, the giant sequoia, one that gets our attention as well. I want to show you just for a moment some data that we have on mixed conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada. We also have it in the Southern Cascade Range as well. This turns out to be a form from an early U.S. Forest Service inventory done in 1911. Maybe you can see the date up there on the top. This is a USDA Form 321A. It actually records on the left species and size class in 2-inch increments, 20 inches, 22 inches, 24 inches. And then you actually see yellow pine, YP, sugar pine, SP, white fir, and then incense cedar. So this is really a inventory sheet of an early forest inventory that was done around, this was done in 1911. And we found 4 of these types of data sets, 1 in the Southern Cascades and 3 in the Sierra Nevada. 1 on the Sequoia National Forest, 1 on the Stanislaus with a part of Yosemite, and also 1 in the El Dorado National Forest, and then 1 in the Southern Cascades near Lake Almanor. And here's a picture of 2 of the locations of these data. 1 south in the Greenhorn Mountains. The Greenhorn Mountains have had a fire burning in them recently. This is a wildfire area that's had some burning in the Greenhorn. And then the Stanislaus and Yosemite National Park area there in the central Sierra Nevada. And I put this data up here just to show you, you're talking about a bunch of information. You know, you're talking about 20,000 tree records and maybe survey areas, the culmination of the area covered of the tens of thousands of acres. These are large surveys. Nothing like 10 acres, 100 acres. You're talking about a landscape perspective, okay? So these are really fundamental data sets that give us a sense in the early 1900s before really active fire suppression and also harvesting what these forests actually look like. Here's a summary of the Stanislaus Yosemite data set as one place. A 1911 picture in the lower left is a picture during the survey, and you can see a relatively open mixed conifer stand, big trees, not too much in the understory, but variability. On the right is 2013. I was out there with some students when we actually did the remeasurement. Turns out the rim fire came in afterwards. Remember 2013? That was a big fire, the rim fire, one that got our attention. So 1911, look at that data there. You see number of trees greater than 6 inches in diameter, 22 trees per acre in 1911, about 100 in 2013. And the basal area increased. Remember, basal area is just a cross-sectional area of live trees per acre. And it goes from around 90 to 180 square feet per acre. And then on the far right, pine fraction goes down as other species actually get in. So these 4 data sets that we have in this type of environment, mixed conifer, some of it ponderosa pine, have all shown the same thing. In fact, we've got a paper now in review that actually has integrated all these data sets from the Southern Cascades to the Southern Sierra Nevada. So there's a profound change there. And this is documented now through research that we were able to do and others as well. And I just want to show you one picture that one of my favorite places. This is the Sierra San Pedro Martir, Mexico, northern Baja California, Mexico. Jeffrey Pine mixed conifer forest in the transverse mountain range, about 100 miles south of the international border. This data today, you can go to the Martir today. It's a Sierra San Pedro National Park. And when you compare the inventory data of the Sierra San Pedro Martir, which never had fire suppression begin until 1970, and no forest harvesting has really occurred here. So by no means is it pristine. It's got cattle grazing, suppression occurs since 1970. But when you compare that data from 1911 from the Stanislaus, also the Southern Cascades, also from the Southern Sierra Nevada, and you compare that data to the Sierra San Pedro Martir today, there is a amazing similarity. So that's what the forest looks like today down in Baja California, northern Baja California, Mexico, in the transverse range. Excuse me, the peninsular range. I misspoke. This is the peninsular range, mountain range. As half of it is in California, the other half down here in Baja California. So again, just shows us again, this is a forest structure that seemed to be very common in Jeffrey pine mixed conifer and mixed conifer forest in California. And here's a little piece of that, a relic of it down in northwestern Mexico. Well, let's go to another event. So now, of course, we've had some really difficult fires recently. The Castle fire is one of them. Castle burned in the Southern Sierra Nevada last year. Lightning ignition. I actually saw the ignition point this year. I was back in that country. And here's an area that the Castle burned. And you see, certainly there's a lot of tree density, high tree density, small trees. It looks a lot like the 2003 Stanislaus Yosemite picture I just showed you a moment ago. High tree density, most of those white fir, shade tolerant species in the understory. You take fire out and you have this real significant change in forest structure. So this is kind of the precursor to many areas of mixed conifer and even giant sequoia mixed conifer forest. The next picture is one that kind of breaks my heart. So I was out this year in the Castle fire. We've got a project down in there, and we went to 3 or 4 groves, did a lot of hiking. And you probably saw the headline recently that estimate of about 10% of the old growth or monarch giant sequoia trees were killed by the Castle fire. And there's a picture of one, unfortunately, right there. I have to say, this is probably maybe the most difficult field trip I've ever taken in my 30-year career, walking after big tree dead, big tree dead, big tree dead. I never seen anything like it. You think about that. This tree may be 1,500 years old, 1,600, probably experienced 150 fires in its lifetime through indigenous burning and lightning. And then the 2020 Castle comes along and kills them over vast areas simultaneously. That is a tragedy. That is a tragedy, and it's one that we've just got to do better about, okay? That, no doubt, big sequoias have been killed by fire forever, okay? They get killed, they die, but they don't die at the extent that we saw in the Castle, where you can walk and walk and walk. You find one that's green over there, you find one that's got a top over there that's green. You keep walking in some of these groves, and my God, it's just so many dead, big, giant trees. Some of the areas have had restoration by these fires. The Castle fire also has restoration. We know that that happens, but at a terrible cost. And there's some of the costs right there, plus the human communities that were burned in the Castle fire as well. It's a terrible cost to have restoration when you lose things like that, and also some human communities. We know the KNP complex and the Windy fires are now burning in the Southern Sierra right now, and they're burning through giant sequoia groves. And the giant forest, through its management over the last 50 years, is in very good shape. They've been using prescribed burning in giant forest for close to 50 years. I don't think a wildfire could hit giant forest and cause a huge amount of harm. Kill a few trees, but it's in a condition now with the burning that's occurred in a very viable position. But most groves and most mixed conifer forests are not in that kind of condition. They are not. They are vulnerable. So what are we going to do about it? So I'm going to show you a couple of photos here of some restoration work we've done in mixed conifer forest in the northern Sierra Nevada. So here we are. This is UC Berkeley's Blodgett Forest. And we've been studying the impacts of restoration on this system for the last 20 years. So you see a big sugar pine right there. You also see the same kind of structure maybe you saw in the other photos. This place hasn't burned in 100 years. It's had multiple timber harvests, and it's in a condition that's incredibly vulnerable to wildfire, also drought and insects. So we're going to use some burning. We're going to go into this place. This is 2001, and we're going to go forward now, 2002, into some burning. So here's a picture of our burning that we did the first time at night. Burning windows are being impacted by climate change. They're getting more compressed in the spring and the fall. They're just not as long. They're not as predictable. I think that means we got to start burning in places like the winter, dry winter. There are some winters now in the Sierra Nevada, you don't get precipitation for 3 weeks or more. that is an opportunity to put fire back in that system. Okay, we can't just keep waiting for the fall and the spring. We're never going to get that kind of coverage. We've got to look for these opportunities. That's why we got to be more nimble. We need to have a workforce developed to do this. We do not have a prescribed fire workforce in this state. There are both federal and state initiatives and laws that are actually being considered now to actually try to train a workforce, because we need it. We need that workforce to put fire on the ground. Certainly indigenous people as well, if they choose to work with us and work on their own lands, that's another piece of it. Burning insurance. So when you do a fire in Florida, if you're not grossly negligent and you actually keep to your plan and you have a problem, the state will back you up. There actually is an insurance initiative right now that's on Governor Newsom's desk through a lot of deliberations in the California legislature. Well, hopefully he signs it. It could give some insurance compensation or insurance to people that burn. Then we're going to also need political and public support to do this burning. Burning generates smoke, and by no means are all fires contained within their boundaries. I've been on fires myself in my career. I've done about 140 of them, and we've had some escape. We never had houses burned down or anybody hurt, but fire is a difficult thing to put on a landscape that actually has a huge hazard already. So we're going to have mistakes. I hate to say it, but I guarantee it. If we start burning at larger scale, we are going to have mistakes. And some of those mistakes are going to be big. Some of them are probably, unfortunately, going to burn down some houses. So can you imagine once that happens, when we have just the beginning of a new program, it could shut the whole thing down politically. So that's something, another thing we got to keep in mind. How do we go forward if we want to use fire as a tool in a place called California where we have very little experience doing so? And that's just going to have some road bumps. I just hope we have the wherewithal to get through it. So there's that big sugar pine after one prescribed fire. We see we killed a lot of the smaller trees. In fact, we killed about 80% of the trees lower in diameter than 12 inches diameter. So that fire killed most of them, but of course they're still there. They're just standing dead. We'll go forward a few years and there's that same tree. We're going forward. What are we going to do? We see a shrub response in the understory. We burn it a second time. There's that same tree. Okay. I remember when I had a drip torch here, I just took my camera out and took a photograph. So what's it look like after the second fire? There it is. Second fire, we're starting to see certainly lower tree density. We're starting to see lower fuel loads. We're starting to see that transformation that fire can do. Here is the same tree a few more years later. And what are we going to do? We're going to burn it a third time. So here's the third fire that actually in that sequence of burning at Blodgett. And here we are at the end of the day, pretty close to where we are today. So we got a very nice desirable forest structure. It took 3 fires to do it. And again, if you're going to maintain something like this, you got to keep burning this literally forever. And I think you could combine some of this prescribed burning with cultural burning. When I talk to Val Lopez, he calls the burning that I do industrial burning. He says it's got coarse objectives. It doesn't really look at maybe specific, needs like maybe shrub materials or food or medicine plants. But I think you could combine this type of burning I just showed you with cultural burning simultaneously, where you could actually do some inventory, find some places cultural burning could really enhance cultural resources, work with the tribes, do that burning, and then maybe burn a larger landscape around it to meet other objectives like fuel reduction and restoration. I think the two could go hand in hand, be kind of exciting. So I think there are opportunity to do that. But another thing I just got to emphasize, you do not stop. This is not something you could pat yourself on the back and feel like you got it done. It never ends. You have to keep at it. You cannot let these fires basically go away for 30 years and all of a sudden you got a problem again. So this idea of kind of restoration with fire is great, but you got to have a long-term plan to keep it going. I want to show you one more set of photos here. Now we're going to do restoration with no fire. This is mechanical only. We're going to use machines. So instead of using burning to do the restoration, we're going to use restoration thinning. And there's a California black oak up there in the upper right I'm pointed to in that little red arrow. So watch that one. That's what we want to keep our eye on when we go forward. And you can see high stand density here, 2001, 2002, hasn't burned in 100 years, typical mixed conifer forest. So let's take our machine. Here's a masticator, part of the mechanical treatment. We did a commercial thinning operation. We also then submersible trees that were below 12 inches. We did a mastication from that machine. And at the end of the day, that's the first treatment. And there you see that black oak up there in the right-hand corner. By no means is this a complete duplicate of fire. You see the fuel on the ground. We actually added activity fuel to the ground through our operations. And at this point, when we look at the model fire behavior in this system, it's a wash. We did not really improve it. We reduced ladder fuels, but we increased surface fuel. Okay, so it was a wash really right after the treatment, about when this photograph is taken. Let's go forward a few years. Now we see decomposition has occurred in the understory much faster than I ever would have imagined. And by this point, actually, the number of fuel load in this system has got to the point that it's low enough that this is really an effective treatment to reduce potential fire behavior and effects because of decomposition of that surface fuel layer that I showed you a moment ago. Go forward a few more years and you can see the regeneration occurring right in front of our eyes. There's that same oak. This is incense cedar. So we're seeing the understory develop again, and we're going to get back to another problem if we don't do something. And we do a second restoration, thinning and mastication in 2019. And here's what it looks like today. So I would also argue this is very effective. Okay, this is a very effective treatment. And it reduces potential fire behavior and effects. It has the highest carbon sequestration of all the treatments we've actually explored at Blodgett, one objective in some stand management. And I would just say one more thing about this is when you do restoration thinning, you focus on what you want to leave, not what you want to take. It's really the opposite of many commercial harvests. You go into a forest and you think, I want this diameter size, I want these species, I want this spacing, this regeneration, maybe this habitat snags, and you leave that, and then the thing that's in excess you remove. That's exactly what we've done here. And still, I think we come up with a point where we very much reduce fire behavior and effect potential, and we've also enhanced carbon sequestration and some other objectives. So I think this is another piece of the puzzle. I think another piece of the puzzle is using a restoration thinning application in some forests as well with fire. Restoration thinning, some people would still call it a timber grab. They're trying just to, get somebody rich or something. It really doesn't have to be that way at all if you focus on what you want to leave and the idea of restoration of those systems. I think it's got to be a part of what we're doing in California. So this is my last slide, and hopefully this generates maybe some discussion. What about some outcomes and way forward? One thing I would argue is less precision in restoration treatments. We've got to open that up a little bit. I've been on a lot of EISs and NEPA teams and things of that nature. So many times we talk about we need this habitat for this organism, this habitat for this organism. And it kind of keeps us planning for years and years and years, complexities. And then you look at the landscape around you and it's changing right in front of our eyes. It used to be people like me had to come up with ideas. What's going to happen someday? What's going to happen to the forests of California? Harold Biswell used to talk about this. Biswell was at Berkeley from 1947 to 1972. You know what? We don't have to think about ideas anymore. All you got to do is look out the window. 10% of the largest old growth sequoia is dead. The largest watershed of the largest state water project reservoir, Lake Oroville, burned by 2 severe fires. Creek fire causes evacuation over 100 people in helicopters. What's happening now is almost unimaginable. So we've got to do better with our restoration. And I think one part of that is allowing more variety in the outcome of restoration treatments, both mechanical and fire. Right now, the restoration treatments we're putting on the ground are too low to make a difference. That is a fact. I know we got the 1 million acre goal by 2025, Forest Service, 500,000, state and private 500,000. I applaud that. They got to be a restoration though, just can't be standard treatments that just go on and on and on. Climate change is making this worse. You're darn right it is. But you know what? It's not the biggest factor. The biggest factor is forest condition. I can talk more about that. I've got examples from 2 places we could talk about that. What do you do about it? Here's an idea. What about a U.S. Forest Resilience Act? A new federal law. Of course, we have the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act. These are all profound laws that have caused such great outcomes in this country, all created in the 60s. But you know what? How do you have clean forest, clean water, clean air, and in habitat if you don't have a resilient forest? In fact, it's impossible. And there's no law in the federal system that actually elevates forest resiliency to that level, okay? There does not one exist. I've had conversations about this with lawyers and everybody. I think it might be time to consider a Resiliency Act. And I might even say the Resiliency Act is a little bit higher than the others. Because again, if you don't have a resilient forest ecosystem, how are you going to get those other benefits from it? It cannot happen. So I would argue, I've talked about this since 2016. We got a paper that with co-authors that actually talked about this. I think it might be a way forward to try to focus on what do we need to do for forest resilience? How are you going to define that? How are you going to achieve it? How are you going to maintain it? And then you get the other co-benefits. Right now, we're not doing the work we need, and I'm very worried about it, okay? So tribes, the tribes have so much to tell us. Stewardship, you know what? It requires active management. You talk to every tribe I've ever talked to, people that are doing cultural burning, leaders, it's not passive. It is active, okay? They are active stewards on the land. In fact, Creator tells them to be such. And that's exactly what we got to do. We have to be active stewards of our landscapes. And we got to get that into our DNA. If we do not do that, we are going to be chasing our tails forever, okay? And I think we need to do more on the mixed oak evergreen forest. I think they're much more departed. They're much more vulnerable to fire than we ever would have imagined. We don't have as much data to actually say that, but I do believe it's true because of just how profound fire suppression and exclusion have happened there. The last thing I'll say, 1 to 2 decades. I think we got 1 to 2 decades to change this ship. If we don't change this ship and change the trajectory of forests in this state, we're going to watch the forest change right in front of our eyes, just like this happening right now. I have to give some credit to the state. The state has put money into grants. They put high-level policy development, including the California legislature. I wish that it started 25 years ago versus maybe about 5 years ago, but credit's due to the state. I hope Congress and the Biden administration might be able to match that on the federal side. So I'm hopeful there. I think we have time to do something. It's going to take decisive change. It's not going to be like margins on the edge. Oh, we'll just plan a little better. Oh, a little bit more money. We'll just get a few more projects done. That is not going to happen. It's not going to work. We have to have decisive change. With that, I'll just thank a few folks, and I'll be happy to take any questions at all.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate it. And you might want to close your screen so we can see each other better.
Yeah, I'll do that.
I asked you to focus on what we can do because I think it can feel overwhelming for folks who are concerned about these issues. And I know that this audience is among folks concerned about it. You covered a lot of different topics, and I was thinking maybe we could break it down into 2 categories. Let's start with the forests that haven't yet burned, and then I want to react to your call to arms for our region and other places where the burn has happened. So starting sort of big picture and your remarks just now, I agree with you. And my question is really one of how much hope you have that we can get there. I earlier in my career worked with a forest ecologist who at one point sat me down and said, listen, you just have to come to grips with the fact that most of these forests in the American West are going to have to go through a catastrophic fire to reset because we are never going to be able to treat the forests at a scale that's significant enough to prevent that from happening. Yeah. Once that happens, then we have the discussion that I think you and I are going to have in a few minutes about post-fire. But I just wanted you to react to that. And, for an organization like ours that will respond to your call to arms, our energies, is it worthwhile for us to invest in that sort of national discussion around policy changes? Can they happen quickly enough, or do they need to happen in a very curated way, like around, the old growth? Or do you think at the end of the day, the forces and the fuel buildup and the climate change are so significant that it's almost as if much of the West is going to have to go through one of these catastrophic fires before we can sort of get back to anything that might eventually approximate what Val and his ancestors did, were doing thousands of years ago?
No, that's a very, very good question. It gets right at the root, right? It does. And I still think that we do have an opportunity. I think what you said makes sense. It's going to be more strategic. Maybe you strategize and you just you pick places you think are just the highest importance, watersheds, cultural sites, redwoods, darn right. And maybe you do the focus there. One thing that gives me optimism is, the state of Florida burned 1.2 million acres of forest last year.
Wow, I didn't realize that. That's
1.2
incredible.
million. Yeah, and the state of Georgia did more. Of course, they have different climate, different topography, but they have been able to show decade after decade after decade, they've been able to do this burning, and we have not. Yeah. So I think that you're right. I do think that it's not going to be possible to do all the acres, not even close. But I do think that maybe you could get to a point where you could do some of that transformation of some of the most important areas, learn, get going, make a few mistakes and learn from it. And then, like you say, maybe transition into these burn landscapes, which I'm afraid both are opportunities and also they're nightmares.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the post-fire, what to do, I just want to take one little detour here because there was so much news coverage of the wrapping of the giant sequoia with the aluminum. And it reminded me of early in my conservation career, the debate and ultimate decision to remove the last condors from the wild. I mean, it felt like kind of a Hail Mary pass to be wrapping the base of these great trees. So one, do you think it worked? And two, sort of what are your thoughts on, I mean, that's such a curated form of conservation. Obviously, it's not sustainable across a large or even a medium or even a relatively small landscape. But since folks, I'm sure, heard about it, saw about it, I'm sure there's curiosity about, well, what happened? Do we know? Did it work?
No, I just see the same photographs. And, I know some of the managers at the Sequoia Kings, and of course, that was a General Sherman, one of the iconic trees of the world.
Yeah.
And luckily, they've done the burning around the Sherman and the other grove that really sets it up that I think they might have just backburned from the Sherman. If they needed to, they probably would have set a fire.
Yeah.
And then maybe that aluminum would have kept the bark char off, or maybe a cavity from reigniting. But it really is a very, very small response to a fire. Something like the Castle fire would have run over top of that. It wouldn't have done anything. Okay. Yeah. That just means you got to do that pre-work. You got to get that pre-work done in these groves. So when they do burn inevitably, you're basically going to say, hey, we're probably in good shape. You don't do that, a little piece of aluminum is not going to do nothing.
Yeah. I mean, it seemed remarkable to me. Let's just leave it at that. I mean, I'm glad they did do it, but it just seemed like such a sign of desperation, and just to me was so emblematic of how pathetic the situation is. Right.
I agree.
Well, moving to my region and your call to arms, I think we have thought a lot about the fact that this fire, the CZU Lightning Complex fire, really was in some ways, and I hate to say it, but it was an opportunity. It was a reset. And in a lot of ways, and we've talked about it specifically in the context of reimagining Big Basin, but it's really region wide. So if you were us and you are one of our advisors, what does that call to arms look like? Is it about trying to enact policy changes locally? Is it about the educational moment? What do you think will be most effective to take advantage of that opportunity and not lose momentum?
No, I think your education locally is probably a huge one. There's been so little fire in Santa Cruz County, and I still think most folks feel that it's just a disaster and something that we have to just eliminate.
Yeah.
But then you look at what that CZU did. I haven't walked a lot of it. Some of you on this Zoom probably walked a lot more than I. But I've walked it through places. It looks completely reasonable. It looks very reasonable. Top kill of the can oak trees and the redwood forest, and reduction of shrub cover. Some of that stuff's going to come down in a couple more years as things begin to rot and things of that nature. Then lo and behold, you got an opportunity. Yeah. So I think that reburn will not be that difficult because you've got that whole complex to work with. And then maybe you alluded to the unburned forest near it or unburned oak woodlands. Yeah. You could actually then, cut a fire line, do some work and move a fire into the CZU. And I think from a policy perspective, I think the state has enabled this even through the grants that are available. Yeah. I just saw the Governor Newsom signed the budget the other day. The $200 million annual grant pool is now assured through 2028.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think picking some areas that you could do both education, also conservation. And also I hope, people such as maybe a rancher, maybe a homeowners association might get involved in this. Certainly the state parks, I know they're talking about it. Yeah. But it is a once and maybe a 2-generation opportunity.
Yeah. And so we would aspire to burning again within 3 years potentially in some of these places?
I would guess
again, as you said.
Maybe 5 to 7. It might take that long for the material that's been top killed to come to the ground. Probably a good time to do that second fire. Like our second fire in the mixed conifer was when about maybe half of that material that was killed in the first fire came down. You can monitor that, of course. Just monitor when you're starting to see that dropping come down. Certainly you're going to see resprouting of shrubs and other things. But I think that becomes a great opportunity for that second fire. Start to clean it up. And the other thing is just get into that mode where you're thinking that we are in a program now and we're not going to stop.
Because if you stop, commitment.
Yeah.
It's like
Keep
weight
going.
loss. You can't just do it once and forget about it.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think, though, I can attest from our area, because we've been both burning our own properties. We have used mechanical thinning. Even a conservation organization like Semper Virens uses the kind of mechanical thinning that you showed. Mechanical thinning being a nice word for logging. And it is really difficult to get to any scale. And you talk to our friends at state parks and they'll say that the prescribed burning program at Big Basin, for instance, was one of the most ambitious in the state, and yet it was clearly insufficient. And so some of the barriers you described, I think we're going to have to move quickly to try to eliminate, or well-intentioned organizations and entities who are willing to burn will just be prevented. Not for lack of funding, because I do think funding is increasingly available. It's all those other barriers that you described.
I agree. No, I agree wholeheartedly. You're right. I think the funding is not the big barrier now. I mean, this year, I think it's $460 million in that pool.
Yeah.
You know, and I
We
heard
just
the other
can't
day
spend
from
it quickly enough.
Yeah, half that money is being actually spent on federal land now, just through actual agreements on federal land. So if state money is going to federal land to do work, but you're right. I know this is not a simple thing. I know it's not, but it's also, it's inevitable. I just feel like, you know, people are creative. We want to do things that are basically looking forward, climate change impacts, all that happens. So I just feel, it feels like an opportunity, and I just hope we can have some bumps in the road and those bumps will not derail us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to pivot to probe a little further on the issue of Indigenous burning. And I know there's probably some folks who may be doing an internal eye roll, thinking that this is just some sort of politically correct, you know, deference to tribes and something trendy. I know, first of all, that as you said, interacting, in our experience organizationally, interacting with Yama Mutsun and others has really prompted sort of a different perspective on the world, which I think has been constructive and helpful, as you alluded to. But I'm also seeing increasingly that the various, as Val calls them, ologists, the various scientists are doing research that simply affirms what his ancestors were already doing and already knew. And I wondered if that's your experience as well. And if so, can you share with the audience that that is, that wisdom is legitimate? It's important for us to be listening to it, recognizing it as true expertise and not some nicey nice feel good thing, but really rather something that can help us all solve this sort of intractable problem.
I agree with you. I think the perspective of the active stewardship, you think about that for a moment. I mean, when we do NEPA analysis, we generally always compare our action to the no action alternative, right?
Yeah.
We always compare to kind of standard, which is generally no action, or just pure fire suppression, which is no action actually.
Yeah, right.
When you think about an Ama Mutsun or a tribal perspective, I think you would actually have to justify not doing restoration or maintenance or conservation, right? It almost have a total different flip. You're basically saying we have to do this work. We're stewards of the land. We need to look forward. I think that message alone is powerful, because one thing when I teach, I have a relatively large class at Berkeley, and we talk about restoration, we talk about forests and carbon and things, and students are interested, don't get me wrong. You know what? You start talking about Indigenous burning, Indigenous cultures, everybody gets excited. I think it's also a way that you can really connect to urban areas. I hate to say it, but I think you could connect to urban areas with more of a restoration focus. And the tribes, I look at every tribe that wanted to get involved, maybe with us or others, as innovation centers, looking at things differently. And you're right, it's not going to be something that's just going to turn on and change what we do, and it's not going to change our problems. But you know what? It can be innovative and also can heal some really difficult wounds.
Yeah, right. Right. Well, I just think it brings a shift in perspective. You know, I think there are many people, non-tribal people, who are conservation minded, who think that the answer is to leave a landscape alone, leave it pristine, draw a line on the map and say it's a wilderness area, it's a park, don't touch, and that is the best thing you can do, and nature will heal itself. And that might have been true in the last century, but today I think with climate change and with a variety of other things, and with just the damage that we've done, and the imbalance, that's no longer possible. And so having people understand that the Indigenous perspective is actually active management, may help people get over that hump to understand that tending the forest, caring for it is actually part of preserving it, that just drawing a line on the map and saying don't touch for very few landscapes, is that going to be the future, I think, at this point.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think you hit it right on the head.
Yeah. Well, let's open it up to others, because I could ask you lots and lots of questions. So I'm going to let my colleague Matt share with us some of the questions that the audience has been churning away with on the chat and Q&A functions.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Scott, for all of this. One question that came up that I found intriguing is, and you've talked about where there may be challenges with fire in the future. Do you see any parks that are primed to be the next big basin in terms of, you know, the fuel loads or other factors that they're sort of sitting there ready to blow up the way Big Basin did?
Well, that's a good question. There are a lot of fantastic parks in the California. I have to say Calveras Big Trees. Calveras Big Trees used to be one of the leaders in prescribed burning. In fact, that's where Harold Biswell used to teach. And some of his early students actually went to Big Basin to begin burning. And I know they do burning at Big Basin. I don't want to jump on them. They're doing work there. But I think these systems that basically are drier than, say, coastal areas, I wish I could tell you a park in the state that we could look at and actually say, look at that one. That one's going well. We could all learn from it. And I bet you maybe someone on the Zoom could tell me one, but I don't know one. And that's not to say that they're not there. It's also, tell me a national forest that actually is doing the work that we think might actually lead to long-term restoration and climate change adaptation. I don't know one either. I could point to a couple of national parks. Yosemite and Sequoia Kings are doing pretty good, not on all their land, but some of it. So I guess I have to say in some ways to that question, I'm afraid that I don't know of many that are not in really peril. I mean, maybe that's a little bit too much, but that's what I would argue.
Thank you. Yeah, the guest had mentioned Calveras specifically as an example. I wanted to switch over to prescribed burns. There's lots of questions about that. And first, you talked about the scale being sort of overwhelming, but and the need to just jump in. But how long do you think it might take, were we to start today, to really integrate a prescribed burn program statewide?
I think if you look at some of the things that are happening, workforce development, community colleges actually might be engaged to help with workforce development. Grant programs, they're in place. Some of these laws we talked about, liability insurance and the ability to get this work done. Even a law this year maybe connected to cultural burning and indigenous burning. So I think the California legislature and governor are really moving aggressively in this area. But I still think if all that as a backdrop, we have the funding, I think it takes at least half a generation to really get an operational prescribed fire program. It's just going to take time to get the practitioners, the ability to get the work done, and maybe move it at scale. So I think you're talking about a decade or two, and it doesn't mean that's not going to begin that transformation, and you can begin to transform in these landscapes, but it's not going to be something we're going to turn on like a light bulb. It's going to take time. That's one reason why I think the restoration thinning is also a big piece of this. It's not a surrogate for fire. It's not a complete surrogate for fire, but it does allow us to do some of this work, and maybe we can do some burning after the restoration thinning. But I do have great hope for prescribed burning, but it's not going to be something we're going to turn on very quickly, in my view.
Thank you. And I know it's probably difficult to speak for Val Lopez, but I was wondering if you might describe a little bit for our audience some of the distinctions between prescribed burns, industrial burns, as he's called them, and cultural burning.
No, I would. And this is something that's eye-opening to me. I actually was burned with Ron Good in North Fork Mono up in the Sierra Nevada, and talked to Val about this great deal. When they burn places, they burn sourberry plants. They burn around oaks to basically reduce the potential for them to be lost. I burned around other things like elderberry plants, very specific, intense focuses right on plants that have indigenous values, okay? When I did burning at Blodgett, like I showed you those pictures, that sequence of 3 photos, we top killed probably 80% of the California black oaks because the fuel loads around those trees were too high, and when we burned them, enough heat from those fires got in through the bark and top killed the trees. Many of them sprouted, but huge oaks, and we were killing them. Val says, well, that's a tragedy. You need to slow down. And so did Ron Good. You need to slow down, take some actions to try to conserve those oaks, do a little raking, burn out a season. So that's what they call what I do and many do industrial burning. You're kind of going after broad objectives, but you're not really going after specific objectives for cultural purposes. I still think you can meld the two together and actually have a program, but there is a difference, and the tribes will tell you, at least they've told me very clearly.
And then, thank you. And what would you suspect needs to happen to manage around some of the local challenges with prescribed burning, whether it's homes that interface with forests, air quality boards, those kinds of challenges in the local experience?
No, those are very real and very important. I wonder if a small community like Bonnie Doon's been pretty darn active, and maybe they choose to work with their fire department and say, okay, of course, the fire was all around Bonnie Doon. Unfortunately, some houses were lost. Maybe after 5 years or so, they start saying, well, how about if we start burning away from our community, partnerships with areas maybe that are adjacent, maybe private lands, maybe state lands. I think community is probably one place really to go. I'm afraid, I used to think that you could really get that hierarchy where you get the state government and everybody kind of working, and then it kind of goes down. I guess if I've gone a little bit further in my career, I really think it's probably more grassroots. I think you're going to probably have communities like Bonnie Doon and other places, Davenport, homeowners association, maybe a couple of ranchers that want to work with another homeowner, and they could be the clusters of innovation. You know what? You start doing that and you start to show something that's working, you know what? People are going to follow. I guarantee it, because people want to do something to reduce the potential. Look what's happening with fire insurance in this state, my goodness. So there's a lot of incentive, but I think maybe some of these communities that could do this work and show that it can be done, show that they have the capacity, learn from some mistakes, I think that might be the way to try to facilitate it.
Well, thank you. There's a lot of other questions, but I wanted to leave with a fundamental one. And wondering if you could talk about what actually happens with fire and redwoods and how they die, how a redwood tree is killed by fire.
That's an interesting one. As you know, redwood is one of the most resilient species on Earth. There are so few conifers that actually will resprout after defoliation. Defoliation by fire, defoliation by logging. Redwood's, of course, one of them. You've seen it. When Mark Finney did his work, he did high intensity prescribed fires, Annandale State Park, Humboldt Redwood State Park. And both those places, we did some burning under really dry conditions. And we were not able to actually kill a tree more than about 6 inches in diameter. Either basal sprouted or it sprouted along the bowl. So even the fire at Big Basin, a lot of those trees, the big ones are resprouting. Some of them, a few have died. So they'll change form, but I think in about 3 or 4 or 5 years, you're going to go in a Big Basin, you're going to see some black trunks, but you're going to see a canopy that's come back. You're going to go, holy Toledo. So redwood is one of the most fire resilient species on Earth. And I think you can kill the small trees, maybe 10 inches diameter and smaller. I think it's hard to kill a big one. So I think that's another one of the things that's got going for it, right? I mean, it's not to say we want Big Basin to burn like it did. Of course we don't. We don't want to see crown fire in there. We don't want to see homes and structures lost. But the potential to burn in redwood under relatively low humidity is pretty darn good. We don't have a lot of experience in it, and it's not going to be simple and clean. But I just don't know what the alternative. The alternative is just allowing these systems to be changed right in front of our eyes. And I think that Amma Mutson and others tell us it's time for us to be land stewards, active land stewards.
Yeah, on that note, I will say I was at Big Basin last week, and one of the things that was incredibly heartening is almost all the trees had green growth up their trunks and on their stems, and they look ridiculous, but they're growing and they're alive, and the survival rate that we hear from the state forester is over 90%, but that's redwoods. And if I think the redwood forest in our region looks sad post-fire, it sobers me to think about what other forest types that are a lot less resilient are going to look like and what their viability is going to be long term. So not to be negative, it's just to say I think that your call to arms is essential. And I want to just remind people that there are things you can do. And I don't just mean supporting Semper Virens and similar conservation organizations. There is legislation being considered right now. Semper Virens will share with you some of the legislation that's in play Communicate with your members of the state legislature, with the governor, thank them for the things they are doing, encourage them in the directions we need them to be going. We will try to be a resource for you in that regard. And Scott has offered to share some materials with us about policies that are moving ahead. So play a part in this, play a part locally if you live in one of these communities that is at fire risk or has burned. But also if you live in New York City, but care about these places, there are ways you can weigh in with elected officials. So I just want to invite that. Thank you, Scott. We will bring you back again. Thank you for being a supporter of Semper Virens on our science advisory panel. Thank you for the work you do in this region. It's essential. And to our audience, thank you for your engagement. I'm sorry we didn't get to every question. We will try to get back to you on some of these. And I really invite you to join us for some of our upcoming webinars. October 26th, we will be talking about our dam removal project and hopefully reporting back on some of the coho salmon. I hope, having gone now up past the stream, that may be too optimistic of a timeline, but and then in November 16th, we will go a very different route and be inviting a guest from REI to talk about the opt-outside effort and the movement to try to get more people out to enjoy redwoods and other places. So thank you all. And again, Professor Stevens, thank you.
Happy to mention
Really for all you do for the state and for the Western United States around forest restoration efforts.
Nice talking with everyone.
All
Have a
right,
good
take
afternoon.
care.
Bye-bye.